The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Alessandro Medici prepared for what would become the most crucial day of his political career. He stood before the ornate mirror in his private chambers, adjusting the golden medallion that marked his position as Florence's most trusted diplomatic advisor. At 35, Alessandro had climbed the treacherous ladder of Renaissance politics through careful calculation and measured words. Yet today, he would discover how 7 moments of careless speech could unravel a lifetime of careful construction. Alessandro's rise had been meteoric yet methodical. Born to a minor merchant family, he understood from childhood that survival in the court required more than noble blood, it demanded the complete reconstruction of one's character. Where others saw weakness in his humble origins, Alessandro had seen opportunity. He spent years deliberately dismantling the timid, eager-to-please boy he had been, forging himself into something harder, more resilient. This process of self-destruction and renewal would prove to be his greatest strength, though he did not yet understand how completely it would be tested. The first dangerous moment arrived during the morning council session. Cardinal Rossini, a man whose political ambitions were matched only by his capacity for remembering slights, presented a proposal for increased taxation on the merchant guilds. Alessandro, confident in his position and, perhaps too comfortable with his own influence, spoke without the careful deliberation that had previously served him well. "Your Eminence," he said, his voice carrying across the stone chamber, "while I respect the Church's need for revenue, I wonder if such a burden might not drive trade to Venice or Genoa. After all, gold flows like water, it seeks the easiest path." The words seemed reasonable enough, but Alessandro had made his first critical error. By publicly questioning the cardinal's judgment while appearing to defer to him, he had created the appearance of manipulation while providing his enemy with the substance of opposition. Cardinal Rossini's smile was thin as parchment. "How thoughtful of you to concern yourself with trade routes, Alessandro. Though I confess surprised that someone of your background would presume to understand the complexities of church finance better than those who have devoted their lives to such matters." The cardinal's emphasis on background was deliberate, a reminder to the assembled nobles that Alessandro remained, despite his success, fundamentally an outsider. Alessandro felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old insecurity threatening to surface. But, where the boy he had been might have stammered an apology, the man he had forged himself to become recognized the attack for what it was. Instead of retreating, he leaned forward slightly, meeting the cardinal's gaze directly. "Indeed, Your Eminence, my perspective may be unique. Perhaps that is precisely why Prince Lorenzo values it." This was his second dangerous moment, though Alessandro did not recognize it as such. By invoking Lorenzo's name as shield and sword, he had transformed a policy disagreement into something more personal and more dangerous. The session concluded with apparent civility, but Alessandro noticed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Conversations died as he approached, gazes lingered a moment too long on his retreat. He had spoken carelessly, and, in doing so, had provided his enemies with weapons they would not hesitate to use. That evening, Alessandro walked through the gardens of his villa, a property that stood as testament to his rise from merchant's son to nobleman. The olive trees, heavy with fruit, reminded him of his father's modest shop, and of the promise he had made to himself never to return to such vulnerability. His transformation had been deliberate and complete. The nervous, deferential boy who had once flinched at raised voices no longer existed. Alessandro had systematically destroyed every trace of that weakness, replacing it with calculated confidence and strategic thinking. Yet even as he congratulated himself on his evolution, he failed to recognize that his morning's performance had revealed cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The third dangerous moment came at dinner, hosted by the influential banker Alberti. The conversation flowed around topics of art, philosophy, and the subtle dance of Florentine politics. When discussion turned to the recent tensions with Milan, Alessandro found himself speaking more freely than wisdom dictated. "Milan's duke grows bold because he believes Florence lacks the stomach for conflict," Alessandro observed, swirling wine in his crystal goblet. "Yet sometimes I wonder if our reluctance stems not from wisdom but from weakness. A strong hand now might prevent a war later." These words, spoken in what he believed was sympathetic company, would prove to be his third misstep of the day. Banker Alberti nodded thoughtfully, but Alessandro noticed how the man's secretary, positioned discreetly behind his master's chair, made notes throughout the evening. Information was currency in Renaissance Italy, and Alessandro had just provided valuable coin to those who might trade it against him. The fourth moment of peril came as the evening wound toward its conclusion. Count Ferdinando, a man Alessandro had always considered an ally, raised his glass in what appeared to be a friendly toast. To Alessandro, the Count declared, whose counsel guides our prince toward prosperity. The words seemed generous, but Alessandro, perhaps emboldened by wine and the apparent warmth of the company, responded with fatal honesty. I serve Florence, he replied, but I confess that sometimes guiding requires gentle correction, of course. Leadership, after all, is as much about knowing when to redirect as when to follow. The room fell silent for just a heartbeat too long. Alessandro had criticized Prince Lorenzo, however, obliquely, in front of witnesses whose loyalty could not be guaranteed. As the evening concluded and guests began their departures, Alessandro reflected on how completely he had transformed himself from the insecure youth he had once been. Where that boy had sought approval at any cost, often betraying his own thoughts to win acceptance, Alessandro had learned to guard his inner self jealously. He had destroyed his need for universal approval, his tendency to bend his opinions to match those around him, his fear of standing alone. In doing so, he had built something that could not be easily toppled by external pressure. Yet even this strength contained the seeds of potential downfall. Having learned to value his own judgment above the comfort of conformity, Alessandro sometimes failed to recognize when strategic silence would serve better than honest opinion. This would become clear in his fifth dangerous moment. The next morning brought troubling news. Alessandro's steward, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned, approached with obvious reluctance. "My lord," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are rumors about your comments regarding His Highness's leadership." Alessandro felt ice form in his stomach. In the cold light of morning, his words from the previous evening took on a different character entirely. "What rumors?" Alessandro demanded, though he feared he already knew. "That you question Prince Lorenzo's judgment. That you see yourself as superior to his decisions." The steward's discomfort was evident. "Count Ferdinando has been speaking with others about your comments. He suggests that your humble origins have made you ungrateful for the opportunities you've received." Alessandro understood immediately. Count Ferdinando, whom he had trusted, had orchestrated the entire evening to elicit precisely the sort of comments that could be used against him. The friendly toast had been bait, and Alessandro had swallowed it completely. His fifth moment of danger came during his emergency meeting with his closest advisor, Marcus, a man whose own rise paralleled Alessandro's in many ways. In his anxiety to understand the full scope of the threat against him, Alessandro spoke more openly than he should have. "Marcus, I need to know who can be trusted. If Ferdinando moves against me, who will stand firm?" But, in asking this question, Alessandro revealed the depth of his concern and, worse, appeared to be organizing opposition to potential accusers. Marcus, while loyal, employed servants whose loyalties extended beyond his household. By afternoon, word had spread that Alessandro was gathering allies and preparing defenses, language that made him appear guilty of the very disloyalty he was accused of harboring. His attempt to gauge support had been transformed into evidence of conspiracy. The sixth perilous moment arrived that evening in the form of an unexpected summons to Prince Lorenzo's private study. Alessandro entered to find Lorenzo standing by the window, his back turned, gazing out at the city he ruled. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Lorenzo finally spoke. "Tell me, Alessandro, about loyalty." The prince's voice was carefully neutral, but Alessandro recognized the trap immediately. Any defense he offered would imply that loyalty was in question. Any philosophical response would seem evasive. "Your Highness, loyalty is..." Alessandro began, then stopped. He realized that every word he spoke was being weighed against the accusations already made. Instead, he chose a different path, one that demonstrated the strength he had built through years of destroying his weaker self. "I serve at your pleasure, my lord. If my service has become unsatisfactory, I am prepared to withdraw from court entirely." This was courage born of his transformation. The boy he had been would have groveled and pleaded. The man he had become could face even dismissal with dignity. Lorenzo turned then, and Alessandro saw something unexpected in the prince's expression, not anger, but curiosity. You would leave rather than defend yourself? Defense implies guilt, Your Highness. I prefer to let my years of service speak for themselves. This response, born from Alessandro's hard-won self-reliance, seemed to give Lorenzo pause. But Alessandro's sixth mistake came moments later when Lorenzo, perhaps impressed by this display of character, asked directly, "What do you make of those who seek to divide my court with whispered accusations?" Alessandro should have remained silent or spoken in generalities. Instead, having felt the momentary warmth of Lorenzo's apparent approval, he allowed himself specificity. I believe, Your Highness, that Count Ferdinando's recent conversations spring more from personal ambition than genuine concern for Your Highness's welfare. In naming his accuser directly, Alessandro had escalated a whisper campaign into an open conflict. The seventh and most dangerous moment came when Lorenzo, his interest clearly piqued, pressed further. And what would you counsel regarding such ambition? Here Alessandro faced the ultimate test of the strength he had built through destroying his weaker nature. The old Alessandro would have sought to ingratiate himself through elaborate schemes or vengeful suggestions. But the man he had become understood that true power lay in restraint. Nothing, Your Highness. Truth requires no action, it reveals itself through time and observation. Those who serve genuinely need not fear comparison with those who serve themselves. This response demonstrated the complete transformation Alessandro had undergone. He had learned to trust in his own worth rather than seeking to diminish others, to rely on patience rather than desperation. Lorenzo studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. You may go, Alessandro. And continue your service as before. As Alessandro left the prince's presence, he understood that he had navigated the most dangerous waters of his career precisely because he had long ago destroyed the weaknesses that would have doomed him. Where the insecure boy might have panicked, schemed, or betrayed others to save himself, the man he had forged through deliberate self-destruction had found strength in honesty, dignity in directness, and power in self-reliance. Yet the crisis was far from over. In the days that followed, Alessandro discovered that his 7 moments of dangerous speech had created a complex web of political consequences. His honest assessment of Milanese relations had reached the Duke himself through a network of spies and informants, potentially damaging delicate negotiations. His criticism of church taxation had united several cardinals against him, viewing his influence as a threat to ecclesiastical authority. His questioning of Prince Lorenzo's leadership, even indirectly, had created doubt among courtiers about his loyalty. Most dangerously, his direct accusation of Count Ferdinando had transformed a subtle campaign of whispers into open warfare. Ferdinando, no longer able to work in shadows, had been forced to move more aggressively. He began openly questioning Alessandro's fitness for high position, pointing to his arrogance in presuming to correct his betters and his disloyalty in gathering supporters when challenged. Alessandro found himself increasingly isolated as nobles who had once sought his company became suddenly unavailable. Invitations to important gatherings failed to arrive. Conversations ceased when he entered rooms. The machinery of court ostracism had been set in motion, and Alessandro understood that his very presence had become politically dangerous for others. It was during this period of isolation that Alessandro's transformation proved most crucial. Where the man he had once been would have panicked and made increasingly desperate attempts to regain favor, the person he had deliberately become possessed a different kind of strength. He had destroyed his need for constant validation, his fear of standing alone, his tendency to compromise his principles for temporary safety. Instead of pursuing futile attempts at reconciliation with those who had turned against him, Alessandro withdrew to his villa and used the time for careful planning. He analyzed each of his 7 dangerous moments, not with self-recrimination but with the cold assessment of a military strategist studying battlefield errors. He began to see patterns in how his words had been weaponized against him and to understand the sophisticated nature of the campaign being waged. Count Ferdinando's strategy became clear through this analysis. The Count had not simply seized upon Alessandro's careless words, he had deliberately created situations designed to elicit them. The dinner party, the friendly toast, the leading questions all had been carefully orchestrated to draw out statements that could be interpreted as disloyal or presumptuous. Alessandro realized he was not merely the victim of political opportunism but the target of a systematic campaign designed to exploit the very confidence that his transformation had given him. This understanding led to a crucial insight about the nature of power and the dangers of incomplete self-knowledge. Alessandro had successfully destroyed his weak, insecure, approval-seeking former self, but he had not fully recognized how his new confidence might be manipulated against him. In becoming strong enough to speak his mind, he had not developed sufficient wisdom to know when such strength should be concealed. The revelation came through an unexpected source. Marcus, his longtime advisor, requested a private meeting at the villa. When they met in Alessandro's study, surrounded by books on philosophy and statecraft, Marcus brought troubling news. "The Count's campaign against you serves a larger purpose," Marcus explained, his voice heavy with concern. "He seeks not merely your downfall but your position. Prince Lorenzo has been considering the creation of a new office, Chief Counselor for Foreign Relations. The Count believes that eliminating you will clear his path to that appointment." Alessandro absorbed this information with the calm that years of self-discipline had taught him. "And what intelligence suggests this?" "My contacts in the Count's household report extensive correspondence with Venice and Milan. Ferdinando has been positioning himself as a more reliable alternative to your counsel. Your comments about Milan's boldness have been particularly useful to him. He claims you advocate for military conflict while he counsels diplomatic wisdom." The irony was bitter. Alessandro's honest assessment of a potential threat had been twisted to make him appear war-hungry, while Ferdinando's manipulation was presented as diplomatic skill. Yet even faced with this injustice, Alessandro found strength in the foundation he had built through destroying his weaker nature. He would not panic, would not compromise his principles, would not become what he had once been in a desperate attempt to preserve what he had become. Instead, Alessandro began to formulate a response that demonstrated the full extent of his transformation. Where the old Alessandro might have sought to outmaneuver Ferdinando through similar tactics of whispered accusations and political maneuvering, the man he had become chose a different path entirely. He began by reaching out to those he had served faithfully over the years, not to seek their protection but to ensure they understood the full context of recent events. To the merchant guilds, who had benefited from his economic counsel, he sent carefully worded letters explaining his position on taxation and trade. To diplomatic contacts in other cities, he provided honest assessments of Florence's current political climate and his own situation within it. Most importantly, he requested a formal audience with Prince Lorenzo, not to defend himself against accusations, but to present a comprehensive analysis of Florence's current diplomatic challenges and his recommendations for addressing them. This approach demonstrated the complete nature of his transformation. Rather than allowing himself to be defined by others' accusations, he chose to define himself through his work and expertise. The formal audience took place on a crisp autumn morning in the prince's grand receiving chamber. Alessandro entered wearing simple but elegant black robes, carrying a leather portfolio containing months of careful analysis. Prince Lorenzo sat upon the raised dais, flanked by his closest advisors, including, Alessandro noted, Count Ferdinando. "Your Highness," Alessandro began, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate chamber, "I request permission to present my assessment of Florence's current diplomatic position and the challenges we face in the coming year." Prince Lorenzo leaned forward with interest. "Proceed." What followed was a masterful demonstration of Alessandro's expertise and character. He spoke for nearly an hour, presenting detailed analysis of relations with Milan, Venice, the Papal States, and France. His assessment was balanced, acknowledging both opportunities and threats, and his recommendations were practical rather than idealistic. Throughout his presentation, he made no reference to recent controversies or accusations against him, allowing his competence to speak for itself. When he concluded, the chamber remained silent for several moments. Finally, Prince Lorenzo spoke. "Your analysis is comprehensive. And your recommendations?" "That Florence pursue a policy of careful strength, Your Highness. We must be prepared for conflict while working tirelessly to prevent it. Our diplomatic position should be clear but not inflexible, firm but not provocative." Alessandro paused, then added, "Most importantly, our policy should be guided by Florence's interests rather than by personal ambitions or factional concerns." The last comment, while general in nature, carried clear implications about the recent campaign against him. Yet Alessandro delivered it without accusation or defensiveness, simply as a statement of principle. Count Ferdinando, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke eloquent words, certainly. Yet I wonder if such theoretical knowledge translates effectively to practical governance. After all, understanding maps is not the same as walking roads. Alessandro turned to face the Count directly, his expression calm but alert. This was the moment he had anticipated, the direct challenge that would determine whether his transformation was complete or merely superficial. An astute observation, Your Excellency. Indeed, the distance between theory and practice can be vast. Perhaps that is why Prince Lorenzo values advisors who have actually walked those roads, who have negotiated treaties, managed trade disputes, and maintained correspondence with foreign courts over those who merely observe such activities. The response was perfectly calibrated. Alessandro had defended his experience without attacking Ferdinando directly, while implying that the Count's own qualifications might be primarily theoretical. More importantly, he had demonstrated the poise and confidence that came from truly knowing his own worth. Prince Lorenzo's slight smile suggested he appreciated both the content and the delivery of Alessandro's response. Thank you for your analysis, Alessandro. We will give your recommendations careful consideration. As the audience concluded and the assembled courtiers began to disperse, Alessandro realized that his 7 moments of dangerous speech had ultimately served a purpose beyond his original intention. They had forced him to confront the final aspects of his transformation, to move beyond mere self-confidence to true self-knowledge, beyond strength to wisdom. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that Alessandro's strategy had succeeded where desperate maneuvering would have failed. His comprehensive presentation had reminded Prince Lorenzo of his genuine value, while his calm response to Ferdinando's challenge had demonstrated strength without arrogance. The whispered accusations that had seemed so dangerous began to lose their power as Alessandro's actual competence reasserted itself. Count Ferdinando, having failed to destroy Alessandro through manipulation, was forced to compete on merit, a contest he was ill-equipped to win. His correspondence with foreign powers, initially presented as diplomatic initiative, began to appear presumptuous when compared to Alessandro's established relationships and proven expertise. The new position of chief counselor for foreign relations was quietly shelved, its creation no longer deemed necessary. Alessandro's vindication came not through the dramatic revelation of his innocence or the public humiliation of his enemies, but through the gradual recognition of his continued value and competence. Those who had distanced themselves during the crisis quietly renewed their associations. Invitations began arriving again. Conversations resumed when he entered rooms. Yet Alessandro understood that his greatest victory was not in surviving the political crisis but in discovering the complete extent of his transformation. His 7 moments of dangerous speech had revealed remaining vulnerabilities in his carefully constructed character, tendencies toward overconfidence, insufficient appreciation for the power of patient enemies, inadequate recognition of how strength itself could be weaponized against him. By destroying these final weaknesses, just as he had systematically eliminated the insecurities and dependencies of his youth, Alessandro achieved something approaching invulnerability. He had learned not just to be strong but to be wise about his strength, not just to speak truth but to understand when truth was dangerous, not just to value his own judgment but to recognize when others' judgment might serve him better. The transformation was now complete. Alessandro had destroyed every aspect of himself that could be easily manipulated or controlled by others. Where weakness had been, he had built strength. Where dependency had existed, he had created self-reliance. Where insecurity had flourished, he had cultivated confidence tempered by wisdom. Most importantly, he had learned that true invulnerability comes not from avoiding all danger but from developing the character to navigate danger successfully. His 7 moments of dangerous speech had not been failures but education, costly lessons that completed his evolution from vulnerable youth to formidable political actor. As autumn deepened into winter, Alessandro stood once again in his villa's gardens, contemplating the olive trees now heavy with harvest. The cycle of growth, fruition, and renewal reminded him of his own journey. The boy who had once stood in his father's shop, fearful and deferential, was truly dead, destroyed deliberately and completely. In his place stood someone who could not be easily toppled, manipulated, or controlled. Yet Alessandro understood that this strength came with responsibility. Having achieved near invulnerability through the systematic destruction of his weaker self, he bore the obligation to use that strength wisely. Power without purpose was mere selfishness, invulnerability without service was simple vanity. He resolved to serve Florence not because he needed the approval or feared the consequences of refusal, but because his transformation had given him the capacity to serve effectively. His dangerous words had taught him the value of careful speech, his enemies' manipulations had shown him the importance of understanding others' motivations, his isolation had demonstrated the strength that came from self-reliance. The document of his life had been rewritten through deliberate acts of destruction and creation. Where others might see his survival of political crisis as mere good fortune, Alessandro knew it represented something far more significant: the complete transformation of character through the systematic elimination of weakness. In the end, Alessandro's story illuminated the profound truth embedded in Machiavelli's observation about self-destruction and invulnerability. Those who lack the courage or wisdom to destroy their own weaknesses remain forever vulnerable to those who will exploit such weaknesses. But those who undertake the difficult work of systematic self-transformation, who destroy the aspects of themselves that invite manipulation, control, or defeat, achieve a form of strength that external enemies cannot easily overcome. The 7 dangerous moments had become 7 lessons in the delicate balance between confidence and caution, between strength and wisdom, between self-assertion and strategic restraint. Alessandro had learned that true invulnerability required not just the destruction of obvious weaknesses but the recognition and elimination of how even strengths could be turned against their possessor. As winter's first snow began to fall on Florence, dusting the ancient stones with pristine white, Alessandro understood that his transformation was both complete and ongoing. He had destroyed the man he had been and created someone far more formidable, but the work of refinement and improvement would continue throughout his life. The strong, like the weak, must remain vigilant against complacency. His 7 moments of dangerous speech had taught him that even the strongest fortress could be breached through subtle sabotage rather than direct assault. Words, carelessly chosen, could become weapons in enemy hands. Trust, too easily given, could facilitate betrayal. Confidence, insufficiently tempered by wisdom, could enable manipulation. But these lessons, painful as they were to learn, had completed the architecture of his invulnerability. Alessandro now possessed not just strength but the knowledge of how to preserve and properly employ that strength. He could not be easily destroyed by others because he had already destroyed everything within himself that invited destruction. The snow continued to fall as Alessandro returned to his study, where maps of Europe covered his writing desk and correspondence from a dozen courts awaited his attention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply the hard-won wisdom of his transformation. He faced the future not with the desperate hope of the weak but with the calm confidence of one who had systematically eliminated his own vulnerabilities. In destroying his weak self, Alessandro had discovered the profound truth that Machiavelli understood: that the greatest threats to any person come not from external enemies but from internal weaknesses that invite exploitation. Those with the courage to identify and eliminate such weaknesses achieve a form of strength that renders them nearly invulnerable to the manipulations and attacks of others. The 7 dangerous moments had been survived not through luck or external assistance but through the foundation of character that Alessandro had built by destroying everything within himself that could be easily toppled. His words had betrayed him temporarily, but his transformation had saved him permanently. He had learned to guard his tongue not through fear but through wisdom, to choose his battles not through weakness but through strength, to navigate political danger not through submission but through the unshakable foundation of his deliberately reconstructed character. As Florence slept under its blanket of snow and Alessandro worked by candlelight in his study, he embodied the complete realization of Machiavellian wisdom: a man who had made himself invulnerable through the systematic destruction of his own weaknesses, who had learned that true strength comes not from avoiding all danger but from developing the character to survive and triumph over whatever dangers arise. His speech might betray others in moments of weakness, but it could no longer betray him, for he had eliminated the weaknesses that such betrayal required to succeed.